and partnerships at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, working on innovative models of new cancer reform. And I've just joined a new organisation called Silverchain, where we're looking to innovate and provide digital home monitoring in the post-acute home healthcare business. So now over to my panel members.
Thank you for the introduction, Ziggy. Really appreciate that. I'm Sabine Sheikh. I am the COO for the MedTech Actuator. I have a 15-year career on the corporate commercial side between sales, strategy, marketing, and some M&A work with Medtronic mostly, and then also with Stryker and Cooper Surgical. And I made the transition to the startup side after 2 years mentoring other startups globally and having a passion on the innovation side, and ended up coming on board with the MedTech Actuator about 6 months ago.
And just a quick question.
Yes.
From your experience with the actuator, the landscape here in Australia, what are the most innovative things that are coming up that you have seen in your last year working in the Melbourne environment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the things that I've seen is a new cardiac stent. It has image-guided capabilities, and it's really fascinating. It's a Class 3 device, and it has originated here out of the precinct here in Melbourne.
Thank you. So I'm Jan Tennant. I'm the CEO of Biomedical Research Victoria. I've had the great fortune of having a very long career, but it's been rewarding and incredibly diverse. I'm a scientist by training. I have a special area of interest in the development of new vaccines for humans and for animals, and that kept me engaged for a very long time at the lab bench. But I've also been lucky enough, I think, to make the transition from being a researcher to commercialisation of research outcomes. And I've undertaken a variety of roles both at CSL and at Pfizer. And I think it's those blended experiences in my career that I bring to the role at Biomedvic, because our purpose is to create an environment and to foster and catalyse interactions and collaborations between the health and medical research community in Victoria. Understanding the challenges of doing research, and then having an understanding of the challenges of translating that research into a product or a new treatment or something that the community might want. Understanding that pathway, and one of the things that I've said for a very long time is that it's a very long pathway in some instances, and there is no step along it that is more or less important than the one behind it or the one in front of it. And my feeling is that that establishment of partnership is so very, very important. At Biomedvic, we focus not only on the member organisations and the amazing researchers within and researchers and clinicians within those organisations, but we also focus on interacting with government, because it's about the policy and the priority atmosphere and environment that we operate in that is so very vital to innovation being as good as it can be.
Hi everyone, I'm Rohan. As Ziggy alluded to, I'm a bit of a serial startup person. I guess once you get the bug, it kind of stays in the system. I started as a diagnostic pathologist, or in pathology, diagnostic pathology, and I moved very quickly into the pharmaceutical industry, really quite young actually, I look back. But I'm so thankful for the experiences I gained in pharmaceuticals. I think it really sets you up well in your career. I was 15 years at Pfizer, and then another 4 years at Bristol Myers Squibb. And over that time, I worked majority of the time in oncology. I loved that space. The space was very innovative, challenging, new products coming out in the market, very competitive, and I thrived in that environment. But I felt like I was lacking something. Being in the pharmaceutical space, it is a large organisation. You are very restricted and governed by what you can and can't do. And I wanted to know what was happening in the world outside that space. So while I was still at BMS, I started a business, and the business it was actually really quite different to health. It was actually a luxury lifestyle brand, in fact, and it was more because I wanted to have an understanding of things like international trade, manufacturing, the sales process, all those kind of things that encompass that you need to know in order to build a brand. I still have that business, and then 3 years ago I left corporate pharmaceuticals, and I now work as a consultant. So I do a lot of executive coaching because of my people management experience, and also work with practitioners, medical practitioners, in helping build their business and develop them as leaders of people. So that I find that really rewarding. And then most recently, obviously with Somatrack. Look, I don't know whether you like me or not, but I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the bathroom scale. You know, it's really easy. It sits there on the floor. It's really easy to use, but really the information that it gives you is pretty... it doesn't really give you much information at all. And so knowing that body fat percentage is such an important number when it comes to assessing your health, I thought it was very important that there was something on the market that was accurate and convenient to use to measure body fat, and hence have come up with a device that does just that. And working closely with CSIRO, we entered the... Well, me, my team, there's a team of 3 of us, entered the MedTech Actuator program, and it's been an absolutely amazing experience, and every task I take on I learn something new. Fabulous mentors. It is a true incubator where you are pushed beyond belief, and I like pushing myself, but this really pushes you out of your comfort zone, and I know it's helping fast track the process for me in this space. So yeah, that's
a great segue maybe to some of the others. So there is an explosion of accelerators, actuators, incubators, whatever you want to call them, happening. And it's difficult to know which one to go into, how to navigate them. But it also seems, the one you're in, very intense. You know, you've got to give up your job, you've got to be full-time, you've got to be 100% committed, passionate to it. I mean, what's been the most difficult thing for you, and what tips do we need to know if we're thinking about entering into a program?
Yeah, so I don't think there are many days that I don't work, to be honest. And I also have a family. I've got 2 children. My husband has a medtech startup as well, so it's very much a household thing. You need to be very focused, you need to be very disciplined, you need to be very, I think discipline is the word. Discipline and focused is the word. And take the advice and take all the amount of energy and experience from those around you. And I think the beauty of, especially the MedTech Actuator, is that you come in once a week for 6 months and it's a full-time week, and you sit there and people get brought to you, which is amazing. So you think about the time that saves you, having to source these people yourself. So you're sitting there and all these people are coming. It's unbelievably overwhelming, don't get me wrong, but it's also incredibly energising. So that's probably one of the biggest things for me in this, is that it comes to you and you take what you need from it, and you know, and you're held accountable. That's a big one too, to deliver what you need to deliver in the time frame. So you've got your little, your support team rallying behind you, because they're just as investment in your success as you are.
Just quickly, how many people in the audience have a startup or are in the kind of new biotech space? A couple? Okay. Who in the audience are students? A couple of students. And what about people in kind of AI, data, machine learning? A few more. Okay, all right.
So part of your question related to the incubators and accelerators that are popping up here. So thank you, Rohan, for your experience on the MedTech Actuator. She's not saying all the nice things just because I'm sitting right next to her. I hope it's all true. But one of the things that we are really focused on at the MedTech Actuator is to stay relevant, because there is such a pop-up of incubators and accelerator programs, not just here in Melbourne, but across the nation. And so we are a health tech, med tech focused accelerator program, but in order to stay relevant, we can't just offer an accelerator program. So we've redesigned our program, and we're constantly evolving with that program to make sure it is consistent and tailored towards the needs of what our startups are. So one great example is our shift to an intensive mentoring focus on this round, so the round that Rohan's in. And what that means is that she has time every month with executives across finance, venture capital, marketing, commercial launch, and a serial entrepreneur. And the executives give her one-on-one tailored mentoring on top of the lectures she's already receiving to make sure that she's able to next approach her milestones with the most oomph.
Sounds good. Jan, maybe a question for you. Last week, Startup Genome, a big international organisation, released their report on the global startup ecosystem, and unfortunately Sydney was in the top 20, but it was declining. But Melbourne was on the up and going into the next top 20 as a challenger ecosystem. What do you think Melbourne needs to do to break the barrier to get into the top 20?
Wow. Had you thrown to me and asked me to comment on startups in general, I think I would have picked up on something that Rohan said, and I think it is relevant to your question, but maybe to the edge. I think one of the things that's quite critical is that we focus our resources and our capability, and whether you're in a startup situation or whether you're in a larger ecosystem, like health and medical research in general, it's about using the resources that you have available to their very best import. So one of the things that's key to that is to road test your idea and make sure that the concept that you are wishing to start up with and to develop around is actually meeting an unmet need. And some of the work that BiomedVic does is to bring forums and networks of amazing scientists together, and researchers and clinicians. And it's often tapping into those networks at a very, very early stage, making connections with industry, such as through AusBiotech or BioMelbourne Network and many other industry bodies as well, and testing. Is there a need for this? If I was successful in my venture, could I sell it? Could I introduce it to a market? If it went to a market, who would pay? Who wants it? Asking those very fundamental questions at the very earliest point. And I think if we train ourselves and mentor one another and share experiences, and we do that collectively across Melbourne, and we do it well, then we'll have a chance to march up the rankings. Volume is one thing, but quality can never be understated.
Yeah, and from my experience, the quality, particularly in our medical research institutes, and it's fantastic. There's a lot there. Me, with my other hat on, just coming out of 5 years as an executive at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, we found, we really did work in isolation a lot. We did, there's an ivory tower over there, and you sit up, and we had a lot of fundamental researchers, everyone, fantastic clinicians. Don't get me wrong, they really are curing cancer, but not one section of the organisation did we have something more than kind of advanced Excel spreadsheet. There was no outcome monitoring, there was no predictive measures of cancer going on. We had some databases with, some variants of looking at your genome, but we had nothing sophisticated connecting it together. How do you bridge that gap between the academics and the fast forward-moving people and the hospitals where the patients are and where there's this kind of ready-made test lab that we should be accessing?
So we need to resource ourselves far better than we currently are, and we need to allocate appropriate amounts of support to infrastructure. We have very limited resources in the country, let alone in the state, for conducting health and medical research. As scientists, our inclination is to use that money for the next experiment. But we need support from government, we need policy settings, both federal and state, that actually allow us to build the framework around the researchers, around the clinicians, so that they can do their very best work and be supported, so that when an idea takes hold and is included in a startup or through a tech transfer office at one of the universities, it's actually developed into a state that is ready to take to the next level of conversation. excuse me, that development it requires infrastructure, it requires people who are skilled in business development. It's sometimes the researchers and the clinicians themselves, increasingly often it is, but not always and not only. And that's what I think we need to do in a little bit better balance, get the infrastructure right. Hospital-based research currently is all done under the radar, basically. So that's one big area of innovation that is not nearly as well tapped into as it could be. There's a tension, absolutely explainable and understandable between bedpans and test tubes. The provision of quality health services and treatments for patients comes first, and it always should, arguably, in a community perspective. But research can actually improve health outcomes. It can actually improve and speed up access to patients for new treatments. And it puts us into connection with our international counterparts as well. So our access is multifold enhanced when we're looking beyond just what we do ourselves. It's very complex, and that's one of the roles that we play, is actually informing government as well as we possibly can about all of the different important pieces and how they all work together.
Switching tack just a little bit, we know that, and based on the people in the audience, AI, big data, analytics, robotics is, a very fast-moving place. And Rohan, your business, I guess, is a little bit of predictive medicine, and there must be some tech in there. How do you think, we are placed nationally and internationally in this space, and what do you think we need to be doing to really kind of be at the forefront of this?
I hope this answers your question. So my feeling around the big data piece is I don't think it's something that we do very well, but I think it's something that is really important moving forward, because I think we do clinical research well, but I think anything that happens after something comes to market, I don't. Would you agree, Jan? I don't think we capture enough data to help us, or help corporations, help the medical professionals make the big decisions. So you need big data to make big decisions and to be brave and make some some good strategic decisions about the future and where money's been spent. So I know that even in early discussions around my device and also my husband's device, which is in the blood pressure space, companies that we talk to, and you've got to have your story right. So it's one thing to address an unmet need in the market, but then it's another thing to have the story right for who you're talking to. So these big corporations want to know, what data can we get from your device? What lessons are we going to learn? What is it going to tell us? How are we going to spend our money in the future? How are we going to make more money as an organisation because of your device, essentially? So it is such a massive space, and I think there needs to be a heck of a lot more work in it. And like I said, it's just, don't think about the solution that you're solving right now. So yeah, okay, I can solve the solution that you can measure your body fat in the comfort and privacy of your own home. But what does that mean on the bigger picture? What does that mean for helping the epidemic that is obesity, or childhood obesity? What does that mean for that in the future? So it's really thinking big term goals.
So it is really like Google or Huawei. They really just want your data.
Yeah.
Companies. So then, do you think, as consumers or as the Australian government or whoever our bosses are, they're rightly conservative, or do you think they're too conservative and stifling us from actually playing in the game even?
I'll just make a little comment. I think there's, I do think there's a risk aversion there, and I do think that when you overlay it with privacy issues, and we've all got concerns about those sort of things, so it's balancing that privacy versus a high level of intelligence to make really good decisions for the future. I think there is a balance.
Who in the audience has opted out of the My Health record? Right. Okay. Good. And I, to be honest, I think a lot of that is also about uncertainty and unknowing about what the data is going to be used for. And as far as I'm aware at the moment, nothing. We probably can't even access it. It's probably buried under, or in Scandinavia in kind of the mountains. But very interesting, I think, for us to think about. We want to be at the forefront of, data analytics, and then we ourselves, people in the room here, don't have enough information to make the informed decision to then go and release it and use it well.
I just had a side comment on everything related to big data and the data analytics and whatnot. So while we're looking to build those capabilities here in Australia, we can't forget that medical device is a strong capability that we do have here. And that still needs to be supported by the government and public policy and the investment firms here, because we do that well. We do that really, really well. And it's a shame that in the past, quite a few medical device startups had to leave Australia and domicile themselves in the US just to get discovered and have the funding and then get acquired by a big corporate, only to come back into Australia and nobody knows that they're an Australian company. So while we're working towards the data analytics and whatnot, not to forget the capabilities that we do have.
Yeah, and that's obviously super encouraging that people can access VC. I think it's, not huge amounts, but certainly in the access to seed funding, anything probably between 5 and 10 million, there is investment there and ready for Australian companies.
I think we are generally a risk-averse society around the country, but I was absolutely thrilled last week at the AusMedTech conference to hear one of the First Assistant Secretaries from the Therapeutic Goods Administration speak on a couple of occasions in the meeting. And there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that the TGA is looking to work with the startup community, particularly in medtech, and Sabine's absolutely correct. We are very, very strong in that space. The TGA is looking to be informed by the community. It's looking to be on the front foot. It's talking widely domestically, so in Australia. It's also looking to Europe and to the US to take its lead. So I detected a real appetite and sense for getting over that risk aversion a little. It's going to be small steps. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, sadly, for some of us, but it is a move in the right direction. And I think it's a commitment to being well informed. It's a commitment to having community and the patient at the heart of the decision making and the regulatory framework, but not to do that at the expense of progress and innovation. And so that sense of doing it in lockstep with advice from the community, from the developers, from the startups, from the researchers and the clinicians was really in evident last week with the TGA.
Leveraging off that, we've just had the miracle election. What does that mean, if anything? Is there any, you've talked about your role in advocacy, public policy. Is there anything that either side of politics at the moment is offering that's helping in the medtech space that we should know about or think about?
So one of the big policy levers that the federal government has its hand on, but we've been unsure which way it's going to tug that lever, is in the R&D tax incentives. That's an area that both of the major parties were a little unclear about as they led into the election. There is a position on the table from the coalition, which we're imagining, wearing my other hat as a director of AusBiotech, we're imagining that position will be picked up in the coming days, weeks, months, and may well be prosecuted. Our sector really needs to look into what's proposed in that area. So this is a tax incentive to businesses to invest in R&D and innovation. It's one of the few incentives that Australia offers companies to be innovative, and it's incredibly valuable for clinical trial conduct, for the development of prototypes, for manufacturing domestically. All of those things are vital, and so positive and encouraging position of that lever is really quite vital to our capacity to use innovation as an economic driver. So that's certainly a policy position that the community needs to get behind, with the contribution of case studies that say if that is not placed in the right position, this is what the country stands to lose. Ultimately, it's about access to the new treatments, to the best treatments worldwide. those things are at stake if we don't help our politicians make good decisions.
I was just going to add one more thing to this. The election for the startup world offers some consistency in the grant funding that's available, which is critical. So if a different party had been put into office, then there could have been about a 6-month gap in the funding and whether or not that same funding, like the accelerating commercialization grant, would still be there. So now that we've got some consistency, at least the startup world can rely on that for at least the next 3 years.
Fantastic. I might open up to the audience and see if anyone has any kind of questions or things they want to talk about, prod us on.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation and the discussion. I have a question for Sabine. It's awesome to see that you're moving more towards intensive mentoring at the accelerator. And a few years ago, I went through a Techstars program, and we had something called Mentor Madness, and I found that extremely beneficial. My question is with the accelerator, how much do you do in terms of co-design and human-centered design to really sit together with clinicians and patients to develop products that are actually really needed? Maybe Rohan can comment on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So with the accelerator, we have 3 pillars under the accelerator program. The actuator program. We've got an education and training arm where we work with hospitals and universities, so clinicians and researchers and students, and we work on entrepreneurship and innovation. So if they have something, an idea, we help take that from napkin sketch to prototype with either our programs or through our partner programs. We have our accelerator arm, which is focused on someone already bringing in or a startup bringing in a prototype and having IP, and we help take that towards commercialization. We have some side services that we offer as well, like consulting services for that. Now, to your point, that's a little more intensive on the patient-centric and the needs specifically that are happening here in Australia. We are looking to also add on another program probably in the next year, in 12 months' time, that would be a little more focused on reverse innovation.
I don't think I can add much more to that, but I think it's, from my experience and having, my husband went through cohort 1, I'm going through cohort 3, it's not like everyone comes at the same level. Everyone comes at a very different stage. I was probably in my cohort, probably the earliest stage, whereas we've got some that could potentially go to market at the end of the year. So it's very, I guess the program is very, you could say personalised in that way, in that if your idea is a great one and you can sell it to them and they see value in it and there's a need in the marketplace and there's a commitment to invest in you, they will do everything they can to realise that investment. So it's very flexible depending on what you need at the time.
Just comment. My experience with the actuator is that the majority of startups and people involved have actually been engineers or biomedical engineering, less on the health side of things. And a lot of them do look for more engagement with clinicians and for patients and find it very difficult to navigate the hospital system and translating, well, I've got a product, how would that actually work within the hospital? And one of the cooler things we did at Peter Mac was a partnership with RMIT where there were actually industrial design students came into the hospital to help us, clinicians and patients, to pull it together and kind of come up with the co-design. And that was so it was really early on with just, hey, we need help communicating to patients, or we have process issues here, and to get them in early. But it was certainly very valuable to have someone from sort of academia, but also non-health, working with the patients and the clinicians.
Yeah, thank you. Many times a health-related innovation or a new approach conflicts with regulatory frameworks. It's a highly regulated industry, TGA, etc. My question is, how do you approach lobbying that level? And I'm not talking about Jen, what you said, like educating the government, but really showing them that something is wrong. So, for example, something that requires TGA approval but doesn't fit well into an RCT model, or something that can't be patented but needs an RCT and therefore has no chance of funding. So basically, a lot of the regulations just fit certain historical realities. And if a new innovation requires that to change, how do you deal with that? How do you approach that level?
I would just say it's hard and it takes a long time, and you've got to lobby. So I'm on the board of a company that manufactures cells for cell therapies, new type of cancer treatment. Nevada's filed with, they decided, because it's a living drug, so it's not really a drug. So instead of going through to be listed on the PBS, it has to go through MSAC. Whole new process. It took them 1.5 years. We were ready. We'd run the very first clinical trial, first in human trial in Australia, in the world, and yet now we're 1.5 years behind in funding it because the machinations in Canberra took so long to catch up. Whereas on the trial space, it was fantastic. We're first in the world and we continue to do so on the trials, but the regulatory approval and the funding has taken a very long time to keep up. But, the only thing, in the absence, it was basically lobbying.
I think lobbying is the key. Connecting yourself with some key influencers in the field is really very important, because they may already have access to people who can make change happen. I also think there's probably a lead time that you can make use of in actually lobbying and softening up the pathway. If it is a completely new pathway because your innovation doesn't fit, then you really do have to put as much effort into that as you do into the development of that technology. Because if it can't see the light of day, the community loses. So that's part of your development plan, is actually charting the pathway to market or access to patients or whatever your endpoint is. And that's just as critical to understand at the beginning as it is whether you will have IP, where your funding will come from, who your chief scientist is, all of that stuff. It's just as important a question to have an answer to. Key influences in the field, whether that's a clinician or whether it's a researcher who has a great track record, they can be incredibly helpful. Organisations like ours, certainly in the Melbourne Innovation District, but more widely across Victoria and Australia, we're very happy to put people in touch with experts in any health and medical research areas at all. One of the other things that we do, a bit of a plug for Biomed Vic and our programs, is we're very conscious of fueling the pipeline with people who have an understanding of the processes and research and the challenges of translation of research outcomes. And so we have a program for undergraduates where they can be embedded into a research laboratory, or somebody mentioned before about handling big data. Increasingly we're putting people into bioinformatics positions or into computer science labs that are attached to a biology lab. And if we do that with second years and third years, we're actually not only exposing them to career options, but we're also encouraging them, I think, to see what other pathways they can take outside of academia, but which will all come together in the development of new innovation. So there's a lot of ways to do that.
The only other one I was going to add to Jan's great list was patient advocacy groups. Really strong. Some of them have a really, really strong relationship with government, and linking in with them early and having them part of your journey, and they can really supply with so much valuable information, as well as having your KOLs, your champions, and coming in with that kind of like that army coming in is really powerful.
Yeah, thanks. Just to remind you that the solution to childhood epileptics, or one of the solutions, came through a television program on medicinal cannabis. The TGA opposed it until there was a program, showed 5 mothers who got their children's life back, and the regulator just couldn't. So this sort of ground-up approach, that's what, yeah. And you did mention that, Thank you.
research and technology in the area of people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries. Oh, sorry. Can you hear?
Could you repeat the question again?
Has much been done in health research and technology in the area of people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries?
I can only speak to this part lightly. I have been seeing a lot more startups here in Australia coming up related to rehabilitation, so stroke rehabilitation or brain injury, and things related to like VR, for example, virtual reality and that type of rehab process, which I'm finding really fascinating, and I know there's a lot of corporates that are paying more attention to that as well.
So fairly recently, in the last 2 to 3 months, the federal government Medical Research Future Fund has actually funded a mission, which is a fancy way of saying a consortium of researchers who are going to be involved in researching acquired brain injury. That can be through accident, through sport, through more malicious circumstances as well. So there is quite a lot of research in Australia and elsewhere in the world in that field in general. The field of neuroscience, Victoria, and one of the institutes in the Parkville precinct, the Florey, is in the top 10 in the world. So there is a great body of endeavour, and there's also an extraordinary experience and research skill that we have to draw on. They're just one of the institutes that's part of that program. The University of Melbourne has many colleagues involved in that area, and importantly, the mission that's funded by the Medical Research Future Fund will actually link their expertise with the expertise we have all around the country, so that the task, which is a very, very difficult one, is actually as well attended to as possible. I think that the mission is funded for 10 years. So there's a strong commitment from government in that area now.
Any other final questions? In the front.
I kind of already touched on this a little bit before, but we're kind of talking about how there's a real distance between the clinical setting, what's occurring in research. How does, and we're talking about how extra funding, resources and infrastructure will help overcome this. How does that overcome kind of set things like drug development pipelines and ethics? So how does extra funding, extra resources overcome those more kind of fixed elements? Is that a thing that we need to consider?
So bridging the gap between you're talking about bridging the gap between clinical setting and then what's happening in the real world, is that what you're saying?
And from research, yeah.
And from research. So do you want to talk to that?
Okay, so coming from the corporate side, there was a big disconnect between what the needs are for the marketplace and what was coming out of research, and what was coming out of the innovation space as well, where we couldn't really leverage that for the clinical environment because there was just a disconnect. What we're seeing is connecting the ecosystems, so making sure that the universities or the hospitals, the medical research facilities are communicating with the corporates and really understanding what those needs are. It's not necessarily related to funding, it's understanding what the needs are. And whether you're addressing an unmet medical need that truly a corporate wants to address, or you're addressing a clinical need that is, it's a common need, but the corporates are still looking as ways to maximize that, making sure that you're aligned on that. I think that's where the communication in that and the collaboration is key to be able to translate that. It's not necessarily the funding.
And it also depends on who you're talking to and working with. At Peter Mac, there's probably 450 wet lab researchers. Half of them are really looking at very early stage biology, like true discovery. And in the nicest possible way, they're actually not really thinking, they're thinking about getting a target, but they're not thinking about contract with Pfizer manufacturing a drug. They're thinking way down here. So it just really is a long pipeline, a pathway, but we do need more people working on translational research, so how to get things quickly into a clinical trial and have that balance along the pathway of research. Jan might have a different view.
Yes and no. I think all of our fantastic translational research is built on the most outstanding foundational basic science. So I think there will always be a need for that, and it's about whether we're skilled enough to recognise the bits in that basic science that might make a step change in the development pathway for a drug or a new medical device. And understanding first the opportunity. So what is it that some of the big corporates are looking for, or what is it that your community health strategy has identified as something that's going to make a difference to community and make a difference to people and patients. So being aware of those things is really important. But Australia has an enviable track record in quality clinical trial conduct, in the most respectful and ethical approach to the patient community that is really possible. And so ethics is embedded into our research pathway. We have a range of human research ethics committees around the state and around the country. We have a developing national mutual acceptance pathway where work that's being done in one jurisdiction is recognised and patients can be recruited from other jurisdictions according to a ethics review that is approved, for instance, at the Royal Melbourne. So those pathways are quite well connected, and they actually are part of that foundation that gives confidence to international organisations and, in fact, domestic organisations to invest in clinical trials in Australia and in Victoria. Increasingly, we're seeing the link between the clinic and the research blurring. And so we've just seen in the lead up to the election some promises made from the federal government to put in the last $60 million that was required to establish the Aikenhead Centre for Medical Development. And that's going to be based on the corner of Nicholson Street and Victoria Parade in what was the nurses' building for the St Vincent's Hospital. And that's the Aikenhead Centre is a consortium of clinic, university and institute. So, and your comment before about bringing the engineers to bear to bring an engineering solution to a health problem is becoming increasingly common. And so there's different ways you can access that through a centre like the Aikenhead will become in the next 5 years, through mentoring such as the Accelerators provide. But there are many different accelerators around, and some of that, is choosing the one that's going to be right for you. It's not just a case of follow the money, although that is some inspiration to be got from that. But going to the one that's actually got the mentors, got the process that's actually closest to the concept that you're trying to develop in your startup. So if that is needing a link to clinic, then look for an accelerator that's got those skills and evidence that that's what they do. So,
thanks.
And a question mainly for Sigi, and this is a follow-up from the co-design of the human-centred design question earlier. My context is that I'm a geriatrician. I work in the public and private sectors as well as clinical trials. It's really exciting to hear that the trial you mentioned with RMIT working with the public sector managed to get across the line. I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about how that went and what the barriers were, because I think overall it's a really common sense idea and should be utilised in a much more standardised or widespread way. So what will be the challenges that we would need to overcome over the rest of the public and private sectors to really gain traction with that?
So I think, first of all, most public hospitals pretty much do have their door open, but they don't advertise. So, I kept saying to people with all these wearables and, monitoring temperature, like all of our chemo post-acute, we need to monitor their temperature at home. We don't. But look, why are these companies not saying, well, Peter Mac, can we borrow your patients and run our clinical trial? For us, it costs nothing. It's good clinical practice. we're all up for it. But there's this assumption that kind of working with a public hospital is too difficult. There is ethics, but it's actually really quite easy. And we do have our door open and we want to participate. So we're actually sort of now trying to chase partnerships with the private sector. And I think, you know, obviously there are certain constraints and you need the right leader and the right executive sponsor and the right clinical sponsor, but we're certainly keen to do it. The projects with RMIT have been fabulous for us. We tailored the program this year, so we had 5 honours students leading a project, teamed up with an RMIT professor, so to make sure that there was some academic rigour behind their projects. And then we, based on our needs, so we have a problem with the chemotherapy pathway, so tracking patients through the process, and they were then, you know, a patient who was interested in working in that specific area, worked off and is paired with a very senior clinician to go and develop the project. And then, I mean, we are fortunate that we had foundation funding so that I could offer 50 grand at the end so that we can go and implement these projects. So yes, we did have some seed funding available to make sure these projects then get implemented, but the design thinking, we're just kind of open to it, and it is really co-creation, co-design. Off the back of that, then we ran our Shark Tank innovation ideas. We've got some really novel, interesting things from the, you know, physics department, from our food services, and the one that won actually got accepted into the Actuator Accelerator, which is an augmented reality using VR goggles to look at placement on the radiotherapy LINAC machine. So every time a patient has to go and get their cancer treated with radiation, they need to lie in the same spot, what they call on the couch, on the table, and often they have to have tattoos to line up where they're supposed to lie. Now with this new technology, they can put on VR goggles and make sure they're in the right spot. Save time, improve the patient experience, save a lot of money, means we can increase the throughput on our machines. So there are these fantastic ideas, but it helps to have people from other industries and other sectors and academia come and help and work with us.
So is the barrier purely not advertising, so the public sector not advertising and saying, hey, we've got the expertise and we're open to it? Pretty
much, and I really do think it's really important that you have a clinical sponsor or an executive sponsor. So someone within the organisation who's going to say, yes, I'm supporting this and I'm going to chaperone it through the public sector processes. But essentially that's it. I mean, you would know, a lot of startups or medical innovations are mostly surgeons and doctors, quite a few nurses who come up with an idea and try and work with a patient on their own. But often it doesn't get implemented or succeed because they don't have an exec sponsor, or they end up taking it to their private sector operations or providers to implement.
So one of the things that's vital for getting any new technology product to market is that if it's a regulated technology, is that it goes through the clinical trial pathway. You need patience for that. In Australia, our greatest access and our greatest asset is to work with the public hospitals for patient access. Recruiting into trials so that you can have the power in your experimental design delivered, you need often many, many patients. It has to go through public hospitals. So I don't think that's at question. I certainly know a lot about the Victorian public hospitals and their research officers and their hospital research managers and the hospital research directors, which we've actually got engaged in a forum through Biomedical. That is a group of people and machinery that there is second to none. There are plenty of them out there. Just about every Victorian public hospital has a research component. They're either doing it through their own research office or they're linked into one of the major centres in metropolitan Melbourne. It doesn't matter where the patients are in community, they can be accessed into trials, assuming they meet the criteria, from all across the state and all across the country. That system exists. Tapping into it is exactly as Siggy said, go through a key influencer, find the clinician that's got in the right area, whether it's epilepsy or whatever it might be. You've got to just chart the pathway. There's plenty of organisations like ours. Most of the universities will have a tech transfer office, and the hospitals will have a research office that you can connect with and ask questions. Find the right pathway, and once you're on it, I guarantee it'll work for you if you've got the right idea.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time now, but thanks for participating. It was very enjoyable to be here, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the Knowledge Week. And we might stick around if anyone wants to ask us any other questions or ask for a business card afterwards. Thank you.